Hi everyone, this is Taya, the managing editor of Photomasters, and this is Ian, the founder of Photomasters.
Hey, how's it going, everyone?
Today we're going to be talking about a very important topic, which is camera care, and we'll be discussing some of the most important things that you should keep in mind and a bunch of other tips that might not always seem like common sense when you're out shooting. So Ian, how do you usually take care of your camera equipment?
Sorry to laugh. I get this question all the time from people, and my answer is never a good one. My answer is I'm a professional, which means I abuse my gear. So pros are notorious for not taking care of their camera gear. So when we talk about taking care of your camera gear, this is one of those do as I say, don't do as I do sort of things. So definitely there are specific issues related to gear care that do come up a lot with my photography or when I'm working with people in the field, like on workshops. And so I am more than happy to talk about some of those today.
What are the most significant issues that you come across as a professional photographer?
I think the most significant issues are keeping your camera lenses clean and free from damage, getting dust off of the camera sensor, and then one other really big issue that comes up a lot is making sure that when you move from warm to cold or vice versa, whenever there's any extreme temperature changes, like if you go from a warm hotel room out into the freezing cold for photography, you want to make sure that your lenses don't fog up. So preventing that from happening is another big issue that comes up a lot.
Absolutely. Condensation is a big one, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers can relate to what you just shared. For me, it's cat fur. I take lots of photos of that. So when I'm taking photos, if I'm changing lenses during the shoot, that's not really a good idea because then the fur will end up in my sensor. So might not seem like common sense, like when you're in the moment, at least for me. But then afterwards, you're like, oh, why did I do that?
So yeah, let's talk about getting dust inside your camera, which really means getting dust on your camera sensor. And this is an issue that comes up a lot. When I'm leading workshops, my clients always want to know what lens they should have on their camera before they leave the vehicle because they're worried about changing their lenses outside. And I think that by and large, you shouldn't be worried about changing your lenses, whether it's outside or whether if you're doing pet photography inside. You're going to get some dust inside your camera. It's inevitable, but changing your lenses, in most conditions, it's okay to change lenses. The only time that you really need to worry about it is if you are working outside and there's a lot of wind and there's a lot of dust or sand in the air, or if there's moisture in the air. So if it's raining a little bit or there's some sea spray, then you want to be very careful about changing your lenses. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. I've certainly done it. I have changed lenses in sandstorms. It just means that you got to be a little extra careful. So what I do, pretty simple, is I turn my back to the wind so that the wind's not blowing the water or the dust or the sand directly into my sensor when I'm changing the lens. And if I can, I will get the camera and the lens under a jacket or something like that to give it some extra protection. But you should feel comfortable with changing your lenses, even if you're working outside, even if it's windy and dusty or sandy, because, the most important thing is to get good shots. And if you get dust inside the camera on the sensor, you can always get rid of it. And the simplest way to get rid of dust on your camera is that most cameras have some sort of dust or sensor cleaning mode, and that usually is accomplished by vibrating the sensor. So you can go through the cleaning mode. Some cameras will go through the cleaning mode automatically when you power the camera on or off. And the other thing you can do is to simply use a blower brush. And this is my secret weapon against dust on the sensor. And it's pretty simple to use. You just take the lens off. And with mirrorless cameras, you don't have a mirror in the way. So you can just go ahead and use the blower brush to clean the sensor. If you're using a DSLR, you'll have to engage the mirror so that it flips up so you can clean the sensor. So what I typically do is I turn the camera upside down so the sensor is facing down. And then I'll use the blower brush to blow air inside, hopefully knocking it off the sensor. And then the theory is that gravity will pull the dust down. And that's how you clean your sensor. If you've got some persistent dust, then maybe you will use a sensor cleaning kit. I never use these myself because I'm always worried about getting streaks on my sensor or otherwise damaging or moving the sensor. And so I just rely on the blower brush. But if you've got some really bad dust or you accidentally get a fingerprint on the sensor, then a sensor cleaning kit is the way to go. Just be careful when you're using it.
Let's talk about lens protection.
Okay, so it's important to keep the outside glass of your lenses clean. You don't want dust on them. You don't want smears or fingerprints or anything like that. And so keeping that lens clean is going to be really useful, especially if you're shooting into the light where there might be lens flare and you want to minimize that amount of lens flare. So any imperfections on the lens will create lens flare. So if you've got any dust or grease or grime on the lens, that can help create flare. So, a simple lens cloth is probably all that you need for most of the time for cleaning your lenses. These little microfiber cloths, they're super cheap. You can get them pretty much anywhere, and they're really great for keeping those lenses clean. The only time you might need something more, like some sort of lens cleaner, some sort of fluid-based cleaner, is if there is some persistent grease or fingerprints on the lens. If you've got something greasy on the lens and you use one of these cloths, you might just end up kind of pushing it around and smearing it on your lens. And also, if you're working in a coastal environment where there's salt water, if you get salt spray building up on your lens, especially if your lens cloth is starting to get damp from a lot of cleaning, you might find that you're just smearing that salt spray around the lens. And so then you'll need something that is designed to clean your lens more thoroughly. So a lens wipe that has some alcohol on it, and you can buy these in like any drugstore. These are made for any lenses, like for glasses, but they also work just fine on cameras. There are also wipes made specifically for lenses. Those are probably best because these are designed not to scratch the glass. But the ones that are specifically made for camera lenses are also designed not to scratch the coating that might be on the lens. So you can use the drugstore ones. You'll be fine for the most part. But if you want to be extra careful, get the ones made specifically for camera lenses. And you can use those to clean off any of the grease or the grime or the salt spray that's built up on your lenses. But you definitely want to keep your lenses clean.
What do you think about using a UV filter to protect the lens?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I think there's a little bit of mythology around using UV filters for protection. Because, so basically a UV filter is a clear filter. It doesn't really do much. And most photographers will put it on their lens to protect the lens in case they drop or bump the lens. It's just there to protect the glass. And back in the day when people would buy their equipment from camera stores, the camera stores were always trying to upsell you to buy a UV filter to protect your lens. This was a big upsell item for them. This is where they made their profit, was from the UV filters. And so for years, a number of pros would say, don't waste your time. Do not buy UV filters because you paid $2,000 for this super expensive lens that's got these great optics. Why would you put a $20 filter in front of it? You're just putting bad glass in front of really good glass, and it's going to degrade your image quality. That said, I think that may be kind of silly. So I'm not actually using UV filters myself. Most of the reason is that I'm often working with wide angle lenses that have got like a bulbous front end. And so using filters on those is really difficult. And so I can't really use the UV filters. And so I just don't bother using them. But that said, I have seen workshop clients drop their cameras, drop their lens on the ground. They've got a UV filter on it for protection. The UV filter gets smashed, but the camera lens is perfect. So the UV filter actually protected the lens. And I have dropped lenses. It hasn't happened that often, but it does happen every now and then. And because I'm not using UV filters, my lens got scratched or cracked or otherwise completely ruined. And a UV filter would have protected the lens in that case. So I actually think it is a good idea to use UV filters to protect the glass of your lens. I mean, you've got that $2,000 lens. Why would you leave it unprotected when you can spend an extra $20 or $30 or $40, put a filter on it, and give it a lot of extra protection? If you're worried about degrading the image quality, pretty simple, don't buy a cheap UV filter. Spend a little extra money and get a high quality filter. If you go out there on Amazon and you buy the cheapest UV filter you can find, you might notice some degradation in image quality. Chances are, on a pragmatic level, you really won't notice any change in the image quality. But if you are worried about it, buy a little bit more expensive UV filters. But either way, having that UV filter in front of your lens does offer a lot of protection. And The only downside of having the UV filter on your lens is that you might occasionally need to remove it. So, for example, if you're shooting into the light and you're trying to minimize lens flare, having a filter on the lens might make flare more apparent. So take the UV filter off when you're shooting into the light. Or if you need to use a different filter, sometimes you can just stack your filters. Let's say you need to use a polarizer filter. You can just stack it on the UV filter. But with some lenses, like wide angle lenses, you stack filters, you'll get vignetting. So in those situations, just take the UV filter off. And when you're done shooting, put it back on. But yes, I definitely think UV filters are a good idea, even though I don't personally use them.
Great advice. And what about condensation?
Yeah, condensation is a huge issue. And so this happens when you go from a warm place to a cold place or vice versa. So you're in a warm hotel room and you're going out into minus 25-degree weather. Or you're, in a cold, air-conditioned hotel room and you're going out into the warm, humid jungle to photograph orangutans or something like that. If you're not careful, you can get condensation forming on your lens, on the glass, when you have that sudden change in temperature. If the condensation just forms on the outside glass elements, then a lens cloth will allow you to get rid of it. But what sometimes happens is you get fogging on the interior glass element, and you can't just reach in and wipe that off. And so that's a huge problem. And so the best way to avoid this fogging is to keep your lenses inside your camera bag and let them adjust to the ambient temperature gradually. So if you're in that warm hotel room and you're going outside, let the camera bag cool down for 10 or 15 minutes before you reach in and take out a lens. And when you're done shooting in that super cold environment and you're going back to your warm car or your warm hotel, put the lens inside the camera bag, close it up, and then let it sit around for about a half an hour to an hour before opening it up and taking out the lens. So that's the best way to avoid getting that fogging. If you do get that interior fogging, there's not much you can do. The best you can do is to take the lens cap off the front and the back and let the lens sit, hoping that it'll dry out. If you can get it in some sunlight so that it warms up, that is better. So sometimes if the fogging's not that bad and you're in the field, you can leave it out on a warm rock in the sun, and in a few minutes, the fogging will go away. But if you've got more persistent fogging, then you need to take more drastic measures. And so sometimes what I'll do is if I'm, back in my hotel room or back at home and my interior lens is just really badly fogged, I'll take the caps off front and back, and I'll try to find a place in the room where there's sunlight coming in, and I'll sit it there and just let the lens sit in the sun for several hours. And usually that'll be enough for the fogging to dissipate. If that's not working, or if you're more pressed for time, you can use a hairdryer, blowing warm air over the glass of the lens to try to warm it up and to get rid of that interior fogging. You're basically looking to warm up the interior of the lens as much as possible. Pro tip, don't use a hairdryer on a cold lens. So if you just come in from the cold and the lens is frozen at minus 25 degrees, don't blow warm air over it. Let it gradually warm up to the ambient temperature before you try this trick. If that's not working and the fogging is really bad on the interior, as a last resort, you can bake the lens in the oven. And this is also something you can do if you drop your camera or your lens in fresh water. You can use this to dry it out. And sometimes you can actually bring a camera or a lens back to life even after it's been dunked in water. So you put it in the oven, and you put the oven at the lowest temperature. You don't want it to be warm enough to melt the plastic or the rubber elements of the lens, but you do want to have the ambient temperature in the oven be warm enough that it warms up the lens, and that is what is going to get rid of the condensation. So whatever the lowest temperature setting on the oven is, you just put the lens on a baking tray, put that in the oven, set it to the lowest temperature, let it sit in there for an hour or two, periodically check on it, and you will see the condensation eventually go away. So that's the quickest way to get rid of that interior condensation if it's stubborn and isn't going away on its own. Otherwise, it might take several hours or several days for that condensation to dry out. And so you definitely don't want to be stuck waiting several days in a great shooting location, waiting for that condensation to go away. So the oven thing is a last resort, even though I know in theory it's safe, even though I've done it several times. and never damaged my equipment. It always feels a little weird baking your lens or your camera, so don't do it unless you have to. But if you do have to, as long as you use that lowest temperature setting, everything should be okay. And that will work as a last resort. The best thing you can do, though, is to avoid getting that fogging in the first place. And the best way you can do that is to make sure that your lenses are in the camera bag is sealed. The insulation of the bag will allow the lens to adjust to its new temperature gradually, and that should prevent that internal fogging.
Those are some great tips. Thank you so much for sharing them. And I hope that you, the viewer, learned a lot from this and that you can continue to keep your camera gear safe. If you want to find out more on how to keep your camera gear in great condition, make sure to check out the accompanying article. Thank you so much to everyone for watching, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.